Don has authored major articles on Russia's Lake Baikal, Sweden, Baja California, Israel's Galilee, the ancient city of Petra in Jordan, the Golan Heights, Lawrence of Arabia, Islam, the European Union, Pakistan, India, Syria, Arab Christians, Cold War science, and the Russian Arctic. Don has received numerous awards for his writing, including the Award for Excellence from Communication Arts, the National Magazine Award, an Award of Merit from the Overseas Press Club, and a First Place Award from the North American Travel Writers Association. Don has been guest on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, NPR's Morning Edition, The Diane Rain Show, CNN, Fox, and newscasts around the world. He has lectured at universities across the United States. He currently teaches journalism at the University of Richmond and serves as the University Outreach Director of the Out of Eden Walk, in collaboration with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. It is wearing these hats that Don will address us today, with a call to global awareness and a summary of his own journal via National Geographic to a greater appreciation of the world we share. Please join me in welcoming Don Bell as he presents our keynote lecture, To Walk the World.
Thank you, Meredith, for that generous introduction. Thank all of you for coming today. Thanks also to all the people that she mentioned. This is a group effort. You know, the words on the screen or the organizations or departments represented on the screen have come together to put this day together, and I'm deeply appreciative. I'm really, really happy to be here with you all. I met Meredith back in October. I was here at Northwestern to do a workshop and met Meredith that day, and we hit it off instantly and had lots to talk about, and so she invited me to come back and address you all, and I'm really pleased to be here. As I look out over the audience, it's really nice in certain ways to finally get a look at National Geographic readers. I sense that people in this room have read National Geographic. One of the downsides of being a writer at National Geographic is that you rarely hear from anyone, except when they're mad. You know, you get these hate letters from people who don't like some political statement you made or whatever about your articles, but there's kind of a disconnect from your audience. There are all these millions of people around the world that read the magazine, but you never really get to see them. And so whenever I get a group of National Geographic readers or would-be readers together in a room, it warms my heart because I feel as if I'm among friends and among my readers, and so I'm especially pleased to be here for that reason. I also want to say I spent a couple of years growing up in Chicago, and days like today remind me of really the only clear memory I have of Chicago. I lived here between the ages of 8 and 10, lived in Palatine, one of the suburbs out from town, and my most vivid memory, I think, of living in Chicago was this time of year, April. You know, I was a Cubs fan. I wanted to go out and play baseball, play catch and stuff. And I remember vividly the sting of the baseball against my cold hand on an April day, you know, with trying to push the season, trying to push baseball season by getting out and playing before it was warm enough to do so. I see there's snow in the forecast, and I guess that's not all that unusual here. Anyway, thanks again for inviting me here. I thought what I'd do this morning is to just kind of give a little bit of background on how my career developed and how my own appreciation for global cultural awareness really took root. As you are working with students and trying to inspire them to learn about the world, trying to teach them about the world, about the way people live in other places, it may be of some value to you to know that I started from a very, very parochial place. I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. After we moved from Chicago, we went to South Carolina, where I was seen as a Yankee and had to fight every day at recess for about 6 months. That's another story. But you know, back in the 1960s, Columbia, South Carolina, the kids even at my elementary school were still fighting the Civil War, and so
they still are.
Yeah, still are, exactly. So anyway, that was an interesting kind of introduction to American history, to find out that I was the enemy all of a sudden, which is a valuable lesson in lots of ways. But I grew up there. I got out and loved nature. I loved exploring and going down rivers and learning about natural history and stuff. But my world was tiny, very tiny. And so I'll be telling you in a minute about a trip that I made when I was in college that opened my eyes and started me on a journey that eventually led me to National Geographic and to this podium today. So I'm very grateful for all that. You know what, I'm going to turn on my timer so that we don't go too far over. And I would like to leave room for questions at the end of this. So I think what I'm going to do is try to talk for about 45 minutes, more or less, and then open it up for questions, and I'm happy to answer anything that comes up, and then you'll get another shot. Later, we're going to do a second session, as you see on your program, to talk about the Out of Eden Walk, which I'm involved in, which is a great, great learning tool for educators like yourselves. I'm going to move on from this here. To Walk the World was the title of this thing, but I want us to talk first about the idea of crossing invisible borders, which I've found is a really kind of useful way to look at what we do whenever we start to think internationally. These days, of course, borders are invisible depending on who you're talking to. You know, if you ask Vladimir Putin what the border between him and his country and Ukraine is, you know, in his mind it's an invisible border. There is no border. So, you know, in the geopolitical context, the Islamic State, for example, in Iraq, Syria, in the Levant, and in the Middle East, has this kind of figment, this imaginary Islamic State, this caliphate that they, so they see the borders that were drawn after the First World War as very much invisible. Their reality supersedes that and turns those borders invisible. I was in Hungary a few years ago working on a story, and I was struck by the number of people in Hungary that were talking about Greater Hungary. They use it all the time. The Fidesz, the right-wing group that's now in power in in Hungary, has always talked about Greater Hungary, and they put it on their bumper stickers. It's almost like their signature issue in a way. And so they don't recognize the confining borders that Hungary occupies on those maps. They see Greater Hungary including Hungarian speakers in neighboring countries. Much the way Hitler did, you know, I mean, in the lead up to the Second World War, invaded the Sudetenland, right, because to protect the German speakers there. He ignored international borders. He considered them invisible. You travel to Lebanon, for example, and you know these aren't political distinctions. These aren't counties in Lebanon. These are ethnic and religious divisions within Lebanon, what I call the tribes of Lebanon. There are so many different variations in the Christian, Muslim, Sunni, and Shia Muslim community there. There's also Druze, which is a very powerful community. But as you travel around Lebanon, you're constantly moving across invisible borders as you move from place to place, from one ethnic or religious identity to the next. And of course, the classic case of invisible borders is what happened to the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, where the Ottoman Empire went away, having allied with Germany in World War I. They lost. What happened in the lead up to the peace agreement that ended the First World War was that Britain and France primarily, but the Allied powers had made secret plans to divide up the lands of the Ottoman Empire into zones of influence, which later became countries that we now recognize: Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, the Jordanian Kingdom, Lebanon, Palestine, which later became the map that we're familiar with today, which includes Israel and Kuwait and Iraq and these other countries. So in the aftermath of the First World War, it was obvious that these borders, these things that had been called international borders, were malleable. They were invisible in certain ways. I was walking with my friend Paul Salopek, who we'll talk more about later today, through Wadi Rum in southern Jordan a couple of years ago with my son Charlie. He's the guy in the hat here on the left. And Paul is in the back there with glasses on, and then the man on the right is a Bedouin friend of mine named Haboudi al-Badul, who has been, I met him years ago when I was working on the Lawrence of Arabia story that Meredith told you about. Haboud's a fantastic guy. I mean, he's just an absolute master of his universe. He lives around Petra. He's a member of the Hoitat tribe, the famous tribe of Ada Abataya. Those of you who've seen Lawrence of Arabia, the movie. Hamoudi is a Hoitat, but his band, his sub-tribe, is the Badul tribe. And when we were walking through Wadi Rum, he was far removed. He was maybe 50 miles away from his home territory. And as we walked through Wadi Rum, Hamoudi was really despondent. This is somebody who's always chipper, always adventurous, totally competent at everything he sets out to do, and he was like a shell of his former self. And finally, as we were walking along, Paul and I were concerned about him. We thought he was maybe sick or something, and we finally got to the bottom of it. We were walking through tribal territories as we moved through Wadi Rum that he wasn't really all that familiar with. These were all sub-tribes of the Hoitat, but they were not his tribe. And so he felt in grave personal danger walking through these other tribal territories. As we were walking up from Jordan, or from Wadi Rum up toward Petra, which is a distance of about 50 or 70 miles, Hamoudi refused to leave the highway because he was afraid that on either side of the highway was danger, symbolized here by stolen crossbows. But it was very interesting to me. This was somebody who I had always admired as the most competent person, one of the most competent people I've ever known, one of the most confident and one of the most masterful in lots of ways. And he was reduced to a puppy dog who was walking down the center of the highway to avoid inadvertently stepping on tribal territory that didn't belong to him. These are all invisible borders. Jordan is a country, it's got a map, and all these tribal borders are invisible, but everybody knows it. It'd be like walking around the streets of Chicago. I mean, you go into certain neighborhoods, and it's a good idea to know what that neighborhood, what those invisible borders are between sections of the neighborhood or on a street. Going back to, I was talking about my own personal story, which may be of interest to you. I hope it is, because I'm going to talk a little bit about it here. But in the spring of 1973, I was like a junior at the University of South Carolina. Like I said, I never really left South Carolina. I was a local boy, right? I was playing soccer with a couple of these guys in this picture, and we decided, just for the heck of it, in the spring of 1973, to take a trip, to take one last trip before we all had to grow up, right? And we went from Columbia, South Carolina to Panama. Drove. None of us had ever been in that part of the world before. None of us spoke Spanish. We bought this white car, this international travel law, which is kind of a precursor to the Suburbans of today. It was a big, humongous station wagon. We piled out all our junk in it and set off for Panama, right? From the Columbia, South Carolina. And we just bounced around on these back roads. Before I left, though, I'd gone to my writing professor, my creative writing teacher at the University of South Carolina was a poet, the poet in residence, James Dickey, who some of you may know from having written Deliverance, the famous novel that became a movie. James Dickey listened to me and signed off on an independent study project for me to go. I was a poet at that point, a poet carpenter. I was putting myself through school as a carpenter, writing poetry at like 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to capture the eternal verities before going off and, being a construction worker all day. But he believed in me, and he said, sure, I'll sign this thing. You go off, you get 15 hours of credit to travel around with your buddies on this vacation, as long as you keep a journal of what you see and do. great, a fantastic deal. And so that was my mission on this trip. The others, not necessarily. The guy on the left was on his way to medical school the following year. The guy in the red shirt was just, you know, one of these guys, I don't know why he came on the trip. Everything that happened, he complained about. Everybody knows somebody like this, right? He made fun of the people that we met. I mean, he didn't speak Spanish, so we didn't know what they were saying, but they didn't look like us, they were dirty, da-da-da-da-da. He was like Don Rickles. He was just constantly just riffing on how bad the people were that we were coming into contact with, and complaining mightily about every single thing that happened. We were camping out, right, roughing it, and so there was plenty to complain about. And it just got to the point where all of us were ready to wring his neck, and he finally bailed and flew home from Costa Rica because he had enough. But we had to put up with him for about 6 weeks on this trip. And this is a local guy that we met in Mexico who kind of took a shine to us and let us camp on his land for the night. That was kind of the way we did it. We make ourselves known to these folks. The reason I'm telling you this is because the U.S.-Mexico border here on the right is a very real border. What I didn't realize, having never done this kind of thing before, was that I was in a way crossing an invisible border in my own mind, or in my own heart.